The notification arrived not as a digital chime, but as a stiff cream-colored envelope, hand-delivered by a uniformed messenger. Marcus, accustomed to the quiet hum of his own thoughts and the rustle of turning pages, regarded the intrusion with a flicker of annoyance. His study, a sanctuary of aged paper and leather-bound volumes, rarely suffered such disruptions. He prided himself on his reclusion, a deliberate choice that fostered the precise, meticulous work of a historian. The solicitor's letter was brief, formal, and utterly unexpected. It detailed the demise of a distant relative Marcus barely remembered, a great-aunt whose existence had been a whispered anecdote rather than a tangible connection. The inheritance was Blackwood Manor, a property described with an almost archaic formality, situated on a remote stretch of coastline. Marcus read of its considerable acreage, its historical significance, and then, with a dry amusement, the solicitor's cautious mention of local folklore and unsubstantiated claims. Marcus scoffed quietly. Superstition, he knew, was the refuge of minds unwilling to engage with empirical evidence. As a historian, he dealt in facts, in documented records, in the tangible remnants of the past. Ghosts and curses were narrative constructs, not historical data. The manor, he reasoned, was merely an old house, perhaps neglected, certainly isolated. The prospect of an extensive, uncatalogued archive, however, was intriguing. A new project, a new environment, free from the incessant, low-level drone of urban life. He saw a challenge, not a threat. A week later, Marcus drove a hired car along a road that narrowed progressively, shedding tarmac for gravel, then for a single, rutted track. The landscape shifted dramatically, from rolling green hills to craggy, windswept terrain. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, pressed low, threatening rain. To his left, the sea churned, a restless expanse of leaden water. He passed a stretch where the cliff face was riddled with dark, gaping mouths, the coastal caves, ancient wounds in the earth, now echoing with the roar of the tide. Their presence felt primordial, indifferent. Blackwood Manor emerged from the gloom like a silhouette carved from the very rock it stood upon. It was not merely large, it was monolithic. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, clawed its way up the walls, obscuring much of the masonry, giving the structure a shaggy, wild appearance. The wrought iron gates, rusted and askew, hung open as if in resignation, not welcome. Beyond them, a driveway, choked with weeds, led to a collapsed portico. He attributed it to the sheer scale of the place, the sudden shift from the mundane world to this imposing, forgotten edifice. The air here was heavy, smelling of damp earth, salt, and something else, something cloying and ancient, like undisturbed dust mingled with dry botanical matter. He approached the main entrance, his boots sinking slightly into the overgrown flagstones. The massive oak door, studded with iron, bore the scars of decades of neglect. No bell pull was evident, no knocker. He pushed, and with a groan that seemed to reverberate deep within the house's foundations, the door swung inward. When the single, bare bulb flickered to life, it cast a sickly yellow glow, revealing a cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the weak light, thick as snow. The air was frigid, still, and impassively dry, despite the exterior dampness. It felt as though no breath had disturbed it for generations. Tarnished portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow him from the gloom. The silence was profound. Not merely the absence of sound, but an active, pressing entity that absorbed any noise Marcus made. His footsteps muffled, his breathing unnaturally loud in his own ears. He felt a peculiar pressure, a subtle weight on his chest, as if the very air was denser here, or perhaps, as if something else occupied the space, something vast and unseen, pushing in from all sides. Marcus walked further, his historian's curiosity battling a growing, illogical unease. He ran a hand over a mahogany table, its surface gritty beneath his palm. The sheer scale of the house was overwhelming. He found the library first, a vast chamber lined floor to ceiling with books, their spines muted by time. This, he thought, was where his work would begin. This was the tangible past, waiting to be unearthed. Yet, as he stood amidst the silent stacks, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floorboards. A sound, like a sigh of ancient wood, echoed from somewhere deep within the house. He told himself it was the house settling, the old timbers creaking under their own weight. He was a man of logic, a scholar of history. He would not succumb to the imaginings of local gossip. Marcus found a grim satisfaction in the silence of the manor. The estate agent had departed with a final, lingering glance that Marcus had interpreted as pity, or perhaps a residual local superstition. He dismissed it. His purpose here was not to entertain fanciful notions, but to unearth facts, to reconstruct a verifiable narrative from the dust and decay. He spent the first few days establishing a base of operations, crates of his research materials, volumes on regional history, architectural surveys, genealogical records, and his own meticulously organized notes were unpacked. Each box opened, each document sorted, was a small victory against the looming disarray of the house itself. On the third evening, as a biting wind rattled a loose pane in an upstairs window, Marcus felt it for the first time. A sudden, profound drop in temperature. This was localized. A pocket of frigid air that seemed to press against his left side as he sorted through a collection of 18th century parish records. He paused, his fingers still on the brittle paper. He glanced around the cavernous library. No open windows, no obvious drafts. He shivered, a reflex more than a sign of discomfort, and continued his work. An old house settling, he thought. Thermal currents shifting. He made a mental note to check the window seals. The following afternoon, while cross-referencing land deeds, he heard it. The sound was indistinct, like dry leaves skittering across flagstones, or distant voices carried on a gale. Marcus stopped, listening intently. The manor offered only its usual symphony of creaks and groans, the groan of ancient timbers, the rustle of the wind outside. He strained his ears. Nothing. He shook his head. Old pipes, perhaps, or the wind whistling through a gap in the masonry. His mind, ever analytical, sought the most logical explanation. He resumed his task, a faint frown etched between his brows. A week into his residency, the subtle anomalies began to increase in frequency. He would leave his reading glasses on the sturdy oak desk, only to find them moments later resting atop a stack of unrelated maps on a different table. A particular volume on local folklore, which he had deliberately placed spine out for easy retrieval, would be found turned spine in, or even upside down. He was a creature of habit, meticulous to a fault. Yet, he always found a rational explanation. I must be more tired than I think. Distracted, preoccupied with the sheer volume of material. He meticulously repositioned the objects, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. One blustery morning, while cataloging a collection of deeds related to the manor's original construction, he uncovered a small, leather-bound volume tucked away in a false bottom of an old writing slope. It wasn't a ledger, nor a formal document. It was a journal, its pages brittle, its ink faded. The script was an elegant, looping hand, but the words themselves were increasingly disjointed. The entries chronicled the thoughts of a previous owner, a woman named Eleanor, from the late 19th century. Marcus began to read, intrigued by the personal glimpse into the past. Initially, Eleanor's entries detailed the mundane upkeep of the estate, the struggles with local laborers, the beauty of the stormy coast. She often mentioned the wild beauty of the coastal caves, sketching them crudely in the margins of one entry, almost as if drawing a place of escape or contemplation. But gradually, the tone shifted. The air grows heavy. One entry read, dated months after her initial arrival. A weight presses in. My thoughts, they are not my own. I hear echoes, faint and mocking, from the walls themselves. Later entries became more fragmented, the script less steady. It watches. My memories, they slip away, like sand through my fingers. The garden. I remember planting roses, but the gardener insists it was always lavender. Paranoia, perhaps, or the onset of some degenerative mental condition. He had encountered similar accounts in his historical research, particularly among reclusive individuals living in isolation. The human mind, he knew, was fragile. He turned another page. The portraits, their eyes follow me. They know what it takes. And fetus. The final entry, scrawled almost illegibly, was simply a series of repeated, frantic lines. It waits. It hungers. It will consume. He closed the journal slowly, the dry leather creaking. A historian's curiosity warred with a prickle of unease. This Eleanor, a tragic figure, clearly suffered from a profound mental deterioration. He recognized the patterns of delusion, the descent into madness. The manor, isolated and imposing, had likely amplified her psychological vulnerabilities. He tucked the journal aside, a morbid but fascinating addition to his collection of historical human struggles. Yet, as he reached for his pen, he noticed it was not where he had left it. It was resting on the closed journal itself, a place he was certain he had not put it. He stared at the pen, then at the journal, a faint, inexplicable tremor running through his hand. He picked up the pen, his grip tighter than necessary, and began to write a note about Eleanor's apparent psychosis. The journal, its leather cover still warm from his touch, lay closed on the desk. Marcus regarded it, a faint line forming between his brows. Eleanor's descent, meticulously chronicled in those fragile pages, seemed a textbook case of a mind unraveling under isolation. He, a historian of the rational, the verifiable, understood the fragile architecture of the human psyche. The manor, he reasoned, was simply too much for her, its vastness and silence an echo chamber for burgeoning anxieties. Yet, an insistent thread of unease had begun to weave itself into his days since he'd started reading. He found himself pausing more often, listening. The old house breathed around him a symphony of creaks and groans from settling timbers and shifting foundations. But now, amidst the familiar sounds, he detected anomalies. It was too indistinct to form words, more like the rustling of dry leaves or the soft exhalation of breath. Peripheral vision became a tormentor, a flicker by the library door, a ripple of movement in the reflection of a window pane. When he focused directly, they dissolved, leaving only the solid, familiar architecture. He attributed it to eyes strained, to the flickering gaslights, to the sheer age of the place playing tricks on his perception. But the incidents accumulated, a subtle, unnerving tally. Sleep, once a deep, restorative plunge, grew troubled. His nights were now punctuated by vivid, suffocating nightmares. He dreamed of vast, empty rooms, the air thick with an unspoken presence. Driven by a need to understand, to rationalize these escalating phenomena, Marcus immersed himself in the manor's archives. He requested access to local historical records from the town clerk, poring over land deeds, census documents, and old newspaper clippings. He sought a pattern, a logical explanation for Aliner's decline and for the unsettling atmosphere that now permeated his own existence. The deeper he delved, the more disturbing the threads he uncovered. The manor had a history of long-term residents, often individuals seeking seclusion or a quiet life. The solicitor who managed the estate's affairs provided him with a list of previous owners and their tenures. Marcus cross-referenced these names with the local archives. There was a landowner in the late 17th century, a reclusive botanist, who had vanished without a trace after a decade within the manor's walls. Her maid, who fled the manor shortly after, spoke to the local constable of the mistress's madness, how he would scream at empty corners and claw at the walls. The 19th century brought a renowned poet who, after a prolific start, grew increasingly withdrawn. The local magistrate ruled it a suicide, a common fate among those who sought solitude in the manor. Marcus found another entry closer to Aliner's time. A retired naval officer, celebrated for his bravery, bought the manor in the early 20th century. Mass disappearance, suicide, all linked to prolonged isolation within the manor. His historian's mind, usually so adept at finding logical connections, found only a terrifying anomaly. It wasn't just Aliner. It was a succession of lives, each one touched by the manor, each one ending in despair or oblivion. The rational explanations, the psychological deductions, felt thin, porous, insufficient against this accumulating weight of evidence. This house, this ancient, isolated place, was not merely a passive witness to tragedy, and he, Marcus, was now its latest inhabitant. He was beginning to hear its song. The pattern was too consistent, too specific. Mass disappearance, suicide. It wasn't just Aliner. Marcus traced the names in his ledger, a cold certainty seeping into his bones that this was no mere coincidence, no simple string of unfortunate events. The manor, he felt, was not a passive observer. He pushed back from the heavy oak desk, the creak of the chair echoing unnaturally loud in the library's cavernous space. The air, usually still, felt charged, thick with an unseen presence. He had been alone for hours, yet the sensation of being watched, analyzed, had grown steadily more acute. It was a pressure behind his eyes, a prickle on the nape of his neck that no amount of rationalization could dispel. Only the towering shelves of forgotten texts, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of late afternoon sun. A faint, acrid scent, like burnt sugar mixed with old iron, wafted past him. He sniffed, turning his head, but the smell vanished as quickly as it appeared. His stomach tightened. This was the fatigue, he told himself. The ceaseless research, the isolation. He needed fresh air. He moved towards the corridor, his footsteps unusually heavy on the worn Persian rug. As he passed the archway leading to the drawing room, a sudden, vivid image flared in his mind. He saw a woman, her face contorted in silent agony, pressing a delicate, trembling hand against a pane of glass. Her gown, a deep emerald, billowed as if caught in a violent wind. Though no breeze stirred the spectral scene, his mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Only a silent scream that tore at Marcus's own throat. The vision lasted only a fraction of a second, a flicker, then was gone, leaving him disoriented, leaning against the cold stone wall, his breath ragged. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them, shaking his head. Hallucination, he muttered, the word thin and unconvincing even to his own ears. The manor was old, full of creaks and groans, certainly, but this was different. This was internal, yet it felt utterly real, an intrusive memory that was not his own. The feeling of being observed intensified. It was no longer a vague prickle but a distinct, heavy gaze, as if the very mortar between the stones held eyes that tracked his every move. He felt judged, assessed, perhaps even savored. His skepticism, a carefully constructed edifice of logic and evidence, began to show hairline fractures. He decided to escape, if only for an hour. He remembered a local anecdote from his initial research, a tale of a forgotten passage, used by a previous lord, that led to the coastal caves. A folly, perhaps, or a secret escape route. He needed distance, a place where the house's silent scrutiny could not reach. Following a faded, hand-drawn map he'd found tucked into a dusty tome on local history, Marcus navigated the manor's labyrinthine cellars. The air grew damp and heavy, smelling of earth and salt. He found the disguised door behind a stack of ancient wine barrels, a cleverly concealed archway that opened onto a narrow, descending tunnel. He switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting a weak path through the suffocating gloom. The tunnel twisted and turned, the rough-hewn stone walls slick with moisture. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast, echoing cavern. The roar of the ocean was immediate, immense. He stood in the mouth of one of the coastal caves, the salt-laden air a sharp, clean shock against his lungs. The sheer power of the waves crashing against the rocks outside was a visceral, undeniable reality. A faint, metallic clang echoed from deeper within the cavern, followed by a low, guttural moan. Nothing, only the glint of wet rock and the rhythmic crash of the sea. But then, the air before him shimmered, not like heat haze, but like a ripple in water. He was not looking at Marcus, but past him, towards the unseen entrance of the cave. His lips moved, forming silent words that Marcus instinctively understood as a plea, a desperate cry for help. The man stumbled, then collapsed, dissolving into a mist that carried the faint, unmistakable scent of brine and old blood. Marcus gasped, stumbling back against the cave wall, the rough stone digging into his shoulders. The house, he realized with a sickening jolt, was not confined to its stone walls. Its memories, its malevolence could follow him. The moment he re-entered the house, the unseen presence returned, heavier, more invasive than before. The lines between his reality and the manor's fractured past were blurring, dissolving. His skepticism, once so absolute, lay shattered at his feet, leaving only a raw, unreasoning fear. The house was alive, and it wanted something from him. Something vital. Madness. Disappearance. Suicide. It wasn't just a leaner. A cold, analytical dread began to seep into Marcus, replacing his academic curiosity with the more visceral unease. He was no longer merely studying a house. He was observing a predator's hunting ground, and he was now the prey. He attempted to re-establish contact with the outside world. His mobile phone, which had previously held a sporadic signal, now displayed only a stark no-service message, a permanent fixture across the screen. He tried the landline, a relic of the manor's previous owners. He tried sending an email from his laptop, connecting to the manor's ancient, sputtering Wi-Fi. The message, addressed to a colleague, detailed his findings, his growing concerns, and his need for an external perspective. It lingered in the outbox, perpetually sending, a digital ghost in the machine. A week passed. Then two. No replies, no calls. He felt less forgotten than actively ignored, as if the world had simply decided he no longer existed. The house, in turn, seemed to deepen its hold. The creaks and groans, initially disquieting, morphed into a familiar, almost soothing rhythm. A strange lethargy settled over him. He spent hours in the library, not researching, but simply sitting, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, feeling the weight of the house press down on him. The thought of stepping beyond the garden gates felt like a betrayal, a severance from something vital. His initial determination to escape, to expose the manor's true nature, began to fray. He slept more, long, dreamless stretches that left him feeling heavy rather than rested. His meals became irregular, often forgotten. He neglected his appearance, the stubble on his jaw growing into a rough beard, his clothes acquiring the faint, musty scent of the house itself. The meticulous historian, who once prided himself on order and precision, was dissolving into a state of disheveled apathy. He knew, intellectually, that this was part of the manor's influence, but the knowledge felt distant, abstract, like a historical fact pertaining to someone else. Marcus, seizing on this sliver of defiant hope, decided he would go. The walk was arduous. The path, once a clear track, seemed overgrown, the brambles snagging at his trousers, the loose stones shifting underfoot. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen decay. A fine mist rolled in from the sea, obscuring the familiar landmarks. The air here was sharp, saline, a stark contrast to the stagnant atmosphere of the manor. He stepped inside the largest cave, the sound of the waves amplifying, crashing against unseen rocks. The light, already dim, became a memory. He fumbled for his torch, its beam cutting a weak circle through the encroaching gloom. He expected nothing, perhaps a sense of freedom, a momentary reprieve. Instead, he found a small, carefully carved symbol etched into the rock face, barely visible beneath a thin layer of phosphorescent algae. It was a spiral, intricate and ancient, identical to the pattern he had seen on the crumbling ledger in the manor's library, the same symbol that had marked Aliner's last, desperate journal entry. The house's reach extended beyond its walls. It wasn't merely confined to the manor. Its influence permeated the very landscape, a tendril of its consciousness stretching to this desolate, forgotten place. The coastal caves were not an escape. They were merely another chamber in its vast, unseen architecture of entrapment. He stood there, the salty spray on his lips, the roar of the ocean a deafening pronouncement of his folly, and felt the last vestiges of his defiance drain away. The house had followed him, or rather, it had already been here, waiting. He turned and stumbled back through the mist, the journey back to the manor feeling shorter, almost effortless, as if he were being pulled along an invisible current. He was home, and he had no desire to leave. Madness, disappearance. Suicide. It wasn't just Aliner. Marcus felt a cold, abstract dread begin to crystallize in his chest. Logic was failing him, and that was a far more terrifying prospect than any ghost story. He paced the vast library, the scent of aged paper and dry dust clinging to his clothes. The gas lamps cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and contract with his movements, making the very air feel thick and viscous. He had spent days, or was it weeks? The passage of time had become a fluid, unreliable thing. Dates blurred, names merged. A subtle shift began. It started with small things. A door he remembered closing on the left would be on the right. A familiar painting, a landscape of rolling hills, would inexplicably depict a stormy sea, only to revert an hour later. At first, he attributed it to fatigue, to the stress of his research, to a mind playing tricks on itself in solitude. He would laugh, a dry, brittle sound that echoed unnaturally in the cavernous rooms. But the laughter died when the changes grew bolder, less deniable. One evening, searching for a specific volume on local folklore, Marcus found himself in a wing of the house he did not recognize. He walked its length, his hand trailing along the unfamiliar wall, the plaster rough beneath his fingertips. A window at the end offered a glimpse of the moon-streaked ocean, but the angle was wrong. This wing should have faced the dense woods, not the crashing waves. He turned, intending to retrace his steps, but the corridor had vanished. In its place was the familiar, sprawling landing of the main staircase. He stood, breathless, his heart thrumming against his ribs, staring at the grand, predictable architecture, utterly disoriented. The experience repeated. Rooms would rearrange themselves. Corridors would lengthen or shorten, doorways would appear or seal themselves off. He began to draw maps, frantic, detailed sketches of the manor's layout, only to find them obsolete within hours. The house was a living, breathing labyrinth, its internal organs shifting, reforming. It was not merely haunted, it was aware. His sense of self began to erode. He'd catch glimpses of his reflection in an antique mirror and not quite recognize the face staring back. Sometimes, it felt too pale, too gaunt, the eyes too wide, too haunted. Other times, for fleeting, terrifying moments, he would see a different man entirely, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, a different cut of jacket, a distant, pained expression. He'd find himself reaching for a pen only to realize he was holding a quill. He'd speak aloud, articulating a thought, and the words that left his lips felt alien, not his own. "The tide will take us all," he heard himself murmur one afternoon, standing by a tall window that now overlooked the churning sea, a view that had not been there moments before. He blinked. He was alone. Where had that thought come from? It wasn't his. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rough. He was Marcus. He was a historian. He had come here to research. How did he? He found himself drawn to the lowest levels of the manor, a subconscious pull towards something ancient and primal. The steps were slick with moisture, the walls weeping. He knew, with an unsettling certainty that transcended mere knowledge, that this path led somewhere specific. The manor was guiding him, or perhaps a memory within him was. The roar of the ocean was amplified here, a visceral, guttural sound that vibrated through his bones. Before him, a gaping maw in the rock face led out into the perpetual twilight of the coastal caves. The tide was low, revealing a treacherous, barnacle-encrusted path. As he stood at the threshold, the wind whipping his hair, a wave of profound, melancholic despair washed over him. This wasn't his despair. It was too vast, too ancient. It belonged to the man with the neatly trimmed beard, to Aliner, to all the others. But he also knew he couldn't leave. The house had woven itself into his very being, blurring the edges of his identity, becoming his mind, his memory. He was not merely trapped within its walls, he was becoming a part of them. He was Marcus, but he was also the man who had walked these caves before, and the woman who had despaired in the tower. He was all of them, and none of them, a fractured chorus of forgotten lives. The manor had finally begun to feed. The pattern had solidified into an undeniable, grotesque messiah. Madness, disappearance, appearance. Suicide. Each life, a fragile candle extinguished by the manor's unseen hand. Marcus traced the lineages, the guest lists, the casual mentions in forgotten letters. It was a deliberate, repeating mechanism. He spent days locked in the study, the heavy oak door a barrier against the encroaching silence of the house, yet also a sealed chamber for his growing dread. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the leaded windows, each particle a silent witness. The air grew thick, not just with age, but with something heavier, an almost viscous quality that clung to his skin. He felt watched, a constant, prickling sensation on his nape, as if the very walls breathed his name in whispers too faint to discern. His research led him down an increasingly obscure path. Marginalia in an 18th century estate ledger spoke of the hunger of the stone, dismissed by a later owner as poetic melancholia. An architectural sketch, found tucked behind a loose panel in the library, depicted not merely the manor's foundations, but a sprawling, root-like network extending far beneath the earth, reaching toward the sea. The lines were not structural but organic, pulsing with an implied, unsettling vitality. A note, scrawled in an archaic hand and almost entirely faded, simply read, "The source. Below the cliffs." This was not a house. It was a digestive system. Driven by a terrible compulsion, he ventured out. The wind off the sea was a raw, biting thing, carrying the scent of salt and decay. The path to the cliffs was overgrown, treacherous, as if resisting his intrusion. The air inside was dense with brine and a cloying, mineral tang like wet earth and old blood. The beam of his heavy-duty flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing walls of ancient, water-smoothed rock. Further in, the cave narrowed, forcing him to squeeze through a crevice, the rough stone scraping against his coat. The rhythmic wash of the tide resonated through the rock, a constant, throbbing pulse. His light swept across the walls, revealing what looked like ancient carvings. Not pictograms, but lines, spirals, and concentric circles etched deep into the stone, almost organic in their flow. They resembled the root patterns from the architectural sketch. Then he saw it, and on its surface, not carved, but growing from it, was a calcified mass, almost crystalline in its structure yet unmistakably organic. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly green-gold light that seemed to draw the air from his lungs. It was connected to the rock, to the very earth, by tendrils that looked like veins, thick and great, disappearing into the water and the stone. As he stared, transfixed, the light within the mass brightened, then dimmed, as if breathing. A low hum vibrated through the floor, up through his boots, into his very bones. It was the sound of something consuming, something absorbing. His mind, usually so rational, snapped into a horrifying clarity. The manor, it wasn't just built on this place, it was this place. The house, the land, the caves, all extensions of this monstrous entity. It fed not on flesh, not on blood, not directly. It fed on the essence of life, memories, sanity, the very will to live. It drew them in, slowly, subtly, like a spider weaving a web of forgetfulness and despair. He remembered Alina's fragmented diary entries, her slow descent into a fog of confusion, her final, desperate plea for release. They hadn't been driven mad by ghosts or phantoms. They had been drained. And now, he was next. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from his chest. The manor hadn't wanted him to leave. It had drawn him in, seduced him with its history, its mystery, its promise of answers. A memory, a cherished one of his childhood home, flickered in his mind, then dimmed, like a distant lantern. He tried to grasp it, to hold on to the warmth, the clarity, but it felt distant, hazy, already fading. The hum in the cave intensified, and the sickly green glow pulsed faster. He was being fed upon, even now, even here, far from the manor's imposing walls. The entity's roots, its tendrils, stretched everywhere. He was already caught. He was not just living in the manor. He was living for it, and its hunger was insatiable. The path to the cliffs, a gash in the earth barely visible beneath tangled gorse and salt-battered ferns, pulled Marcus forward with a grim, desperate urgency. His lungs burned, the cold air a sharp incision with each breath. Yet the house's insidious whispers seemed to recede, replaced by the roar of the sea. This was a fragile lucidity, a brief, terrifying window of clarity before the encroaching fog of its influence reclaimed him entirely. He had to find something, anything, that could sever its hold. The thought was a raw, aching demand in his skull. He stumbled, the loose shale beneath his worn boots threatening to send him tumbling into the churning gray below. The wind was a physical force, tearing at his coat, whipping strands of hair across his face. It carried the metallic tang of salt and a deeper, more unsettling aroma, the faint, cloying sweetness of decay. not organic, but something mineral, ancient. Below, the jagged teeth of the coastline disappeared into the gloom, swallowed by the restless foam. Tales of strange lights, inexplicable disappearances, and a pervasive sense of wrongness. He scrambled down a treacherous incline, loose stones skittering ahead of him, until he reached the entrance of the largest cave. The sound of the waves transformed from a roar to a deep, resonant thrum echoing off the cavern walls, a heartbeat from within the earth. The floor was uneven, littered with smooth, water-worn pebbles and the skeletal remains of shellfish. Water dripped from the ceiling, collecting in shallow pools that reflected the light in distorted, fleeting patterns. The house, he realized, felt distant here, its presence attenuated, not entirely absent. It was a faint, nagging hum at the back of his consciousness, like a distant, malevolent engine. He moved slowly, his gaze sweeping over every crevice, every natural formation. He was looking for an anomaly, a sign that the legends held a kernel of truth. Minutes stretched into an eternity. His breath plumed in the cold air. He chose one, then another, guided by a desperate intuition, a gut feeling that this was the place the old stories hinted at. Not immediately obvious, but subtly distinct from the natural contours of the rock. On its surface, barely discernible beneath layers of salt and mineral accretion, were carvings. Not primitive pictographs, but intricate, angular symbols, unlike anything he had ever seen in his extensive historical studies. They pulsed faintly, he imagined, with a residual energy, a dormant power. The symbols felt alien, yet strangely familiar, tapping into a forgotten corner of his mind. He recognized a repeating motif, a stylized, downward-pointing arrow intersected by a broken circle. It was a glyph, he realized with a jolt, that he had seen in the manor's archives, scrawled almost illegibly in the margins of an ancient, water-damaged ledger detailing the manor's original construction. He had dismissed it then as a builder's mark, an esoteric flourish. Now, a horrifying certainty solidified. This was no builder's mark. This was a key. He shined his light closer, his gaze tracing the lines. There were other symbols too, arranged in a deliberate pattern around the central motif. These were not just symbols, they were instructions, a ritual. He understood, with a terrifying clarity, that this place, these carvings, represented the manor's genesis, its vulnerability. The broken circle, the downward arrow, it implied a severing, a grounding, a drawing out. His mind raced, piecing together fragmented memories from his research. The manor's original architect, a reclusive figure known only as the builder, who had vanished without a trace after its completion. The strange, almost alchemical properties of the local stone. He pulled it out. It was a small, obsidian shard, perfectly triangular, its edges unnaturally sharp. It hummed faintly in his palm, a low vibration that seemed to resonate deep within his bones. It moved. It was aware of his discovery. Marcus stared at the shard, then back at the carved stone. The ritual, the shard, the specific location, it was a method not just to contain, but perhaps to unmake the manor. But the cost, he knew instinctively, would be immense. He had found his weapon, his desperate gamble. The choice was clear: succumb to the house, or face an unknown horror with this razor-edged shard and a forgotten, terrible ritual. The house fights back. The obsidian shard pulsed, a low, resonant thrum against Marcus's palm. It was cold, yet vibrated with an inner heat that seemed to seep into his bones. The triangular edges were precise, too perfect for natural formation. He held it up, its dark surface absorbing the meager light from his flashlight, reflecting nothing. This was not a natural object. This was crafted, and it felt ancient. He pocketed the shard, a new, unsettling weight against his thigh. His determination solidified. It had led him to this, and now, he suspected, it would fight to keep him from understanding. He turned from the carved slab, intending to retrace his steps through the labyrinthine passages beneath the manor. A low groan, deep and resonant, emanated from the very stone around him. The passage ahead, previously clear, now seemed to narrow. He shone his light, confirming his suspicion. The rough-hewn walls had begun to shift, the ancient mortar crumbling as blocks of stone ground against each other, slowly closing the path he had intended to take. Marcus pressed forward, a grim resolve tightening his jaw. The house was fighting back. He squeezed through the diminishing gap, his shoulders scraping against the rough rock. Just as he cleared the constriction, the passage slammed shut behind him with a thunderous crack that vibrated through the floor. He spun, shining his light back. Solid stone, no trace of the opening. A new route was forced upon him. The walls here were slick with condensation, and a faint, briny smell began to permeate the air. The tunnel twisted, descended, then opened abruptly into a larger cavern. The sound of crashing waves, muffled but unmistakable, echoed from somewhere ahead. A gust of frigid, salt-laden air swept through, making him shiver. Suddenly, a shape detached itself from the periphery of his vision. It was not solid, but a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat haze over asphalt, yet distinct. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, its form wavering. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. This was an active manifestation. The figure raised an arm, a hand forming from the swirling mist, long and skeletal. It did not touch him, but a wave of profound despair washed over Marcus, a sudden, crushing weight that threatened to buckle his knees. Memories, his own memories, flickered through his mind. Moments of failure, of loss, of inadequacy. Amplified, distorted, weaponized. The figure recoiled slightly, its form flickering, as if the shard caused it discomfort. He pushed past the lingering despair, forcing himself to move. The figure seemed to dissipate and reform, always just ahead, always blocking the most direct path. It was a shepherd herding him deeper into the caves, away from an unseen exit, or towards a specific point. The cave floor became treacherous, slick with seaweed and barnacles. The roar of the ocean grew louder, a relentless, hungry sound. He stumbled over a slick rock, catching himself just before he fell. As he recovered, his flashlight beam swept across a section of the cavern wall. There, carved into the damp rock face, almost obscured by layers of salt and time, was a series of symbols. They were not the elegant, flowing script he had found in the manor's library, nor the harsh, angular markings on the carved slab. These were crude, primal, etched deep into the stone. They depicted a stylized eye, weeping black tears, surrounded by concentric circles. Below it, a figure, unmistakably humanoid, was shown chained to a structure that resembled the manor itself, its limbs splayed, its head thrown back in agony. From the figure, tendrils of smoke or mist rose, feeding into the house. This wasn't a house that had a malevolent entity. This was a house built around one. The manor was not merely haunted, it was a cage, a conduit, a parasitic organism drawing sustenance from whatever was trapped within its foundations. The figures weren't just inhabitants, they were sustenance. The true horror was not the entity itself, but the deliberate, calculated act of binding it, controlling it, and making it feed. The obsidian shard in his pocket hummed more insistently, as if in agreement, or perhaps in protest. The spectral figure reappeared, closer this time, its misty hand reaching out, but the image on the wall, the chained figure, burned in his mind. He had to sever the connection. The obsidian shard pulsed, a low, resonant thrum against Marcus's palm. This was it. This was the key, or perhaps the weapon. His mind, though frayed at the edges, held a singular, brittle focus. He would find the source, the true heart of the manor's malevolence, and he would sever it. He moved through the hidden passage he had painstakingly uncovered behind the hearth in the oldest part of the house, a passage that smelled of brine and ancient earth, a scent that intensified with every step. The faint, rhythmic sigh of the ocean became audible, a deep, resonant breathing that seemed to emanate from the very stone around him. The passage sloped downwards, the rough-hewn walls occasionally glistening with mineral deposits, catching the weak beam of his light in brief, unsettling flashes. It knew he was coming. It knew his intent. The passage opened abruptly into a cavern. The sound of the sea, previously a distant murmur, now filled the space, echoing off unseen surfaces. This was no ordinary cavern. This was a segment of the coastal caves, a place long rumored in the local legends to be forbidden. A place where the sea met something far older than itself. The flashlight beam cut through the inky blackness, revealing vast, water-worn chambers. The air was thick with the scent of salt and something else, a metallic, earthy tang that spoke of deep, undisturbed time. Marcus stepped onto the wet, uneven rock floor, the obsidian shard in his hand thrummed with greater intensity, a low hum that vibrated up his arm and into his chest. It felt like a tuning fork, resonating with a frequency only it could perceive. He followed its silent pull, his boots crunching on loose pebbles, the sound swallowed by the cavern's immensity. Then he saw it. At its center, rising from a pool of impossibly still, black water, was a structure that defied natural explanation. It pulsed, not just with light, but with a slow, deliberate beat, like a monstrous heart. This was the reveal. The core. It was not merely a rock formation, it was an organic, living entity fused with the very stone, drawing power from the deep earth and the ceaseless churn of the ocean. The air around it was heavy, suffocating, charged with an ancient, malevolent energy. As Marcus approached, the crystal pulsed faster and the chamber came alive. He saw flashes, a woman's terrified scream, a child's sobbing, a man's silent, vacant stare. They were the echoes of lives consumed, minds shattered, identities devoured. The floor beneath his feet seemed to ripple, the very air distorting. His name, Marcus, felt alien on his tongue, a forgotten sound. He stumbled, gripping the obsidian shard tighter. Its vibration intensified, a counterforce against the psychic assault. He focused, pushing back against the encroaching tide of madness. This is not real. This is its attempt to break me. His plan was simple, born of desperate, fragmented research and a growing, terrifying intuition. The shard was a piece of the core, broken off long ago, perhaps intentionally. It held a resonance, a disruptive frequency frequency. He intended to drive it back into its source, a splinter to shatter the hole. The crystal pulsed again, and the black water in the pool began to churn, not with waves, but with a slow, viscous roiling. Marcus felt a tremor shake the cavern, a low growl that vibrated through the rock, through his bones. The manor was fighting back, its ancient, hungry heart exposed and furious. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the salt and decay burning his lungs. The threshold, the ceaseless sigh of the tide against unseen walls was the only constant sound, a rhythm that had outlasted generations, outlasted sanity. But he knew oblivion was merely absorption, another memory added to the manor's endless, hungry archive. He had come too far for that. This shard, discovered in the house's deepest, most forgotten vault, felt like the counter key, the fulcrum. It hummed not with the house's familiar, droning hunger, but with a different frequency, a sharper, more focused resonance. He tightened his grip, the sharp edges pressing into his skin, not breaking it, but leaving indentations. He could feel the house, even here, miles from its foundation, a vast, predatory presence stretching its tendrils through the very earth beneath his feet. It knew he was here. It knew what he held. A low growl, or perhaps the grinding of stone, vibrated through the cave floor. The air grew heavy, pressing against his eardrums. He raised the shard, pointing its sharpest apex towards the unseen heart of the manor, towards the entity that had consumed so many. He didn't know if he was meant to pierce something, to sever a connection, or to simply activate an opposing force. All he knew was the absolute certainty that this was the moment. As he thrust the shard forward, a jolt sharp and electric shot through his entire being. It wasn't physical pain, but a profound mental shock, as if his consciousness had been momentarily ripped from his body. Memories exploded behind his eyes, not his own, but a maelstrom of fragmented lives, a merchant counting gold, a child's laughter echoing through empty halls, the silent despair of a scholar poring over forbidden texts, the terrified scream of a servant. They were all there, a cacophony of lost souls compressed into an instant, overwhelming his senses. He staggered, dropping to one knee, the flashlight clattering against the damp rock, its beam now dancing wildly across the cave walls. The shard, however, remained fused to his hand, its thrumming now a furious, almost painful vibration. The heat radiating from it was immense, searing. It felt as if his very essence was being drawn out in the obsidian. Then came the reveal. The shard wasn't just a weapon against the house. It was a fragment of it. Its core, its living, breathing, malevolent heart, somehow excised and hidden. By holding it, by attempting to wield it, he wasn't attacking the entity. He was attempting to reintegrate its most vital component, and the house, starved and incomplete, was pulling it back, pulling him with it. He felt his identity fraying at the edges, his own memories dissolving, replaced by the flood of the manor's accumulated consciousness. He saw himself, Marcus, a reclusive historian, but the image was distant, fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. It was absorbing him, not just his memories, but his consciousness, his will, his very being. He was becoming one with the obsidian, one with the house. A final, desperate surge of defiance flared within him. He would not simply be another memory. If he was to be absorbed, he would go in fighting, not as a victim, but as an intruder, a virus in its system. He focused every last shred of his crumbling identity, not on escaping, but on imposing his will. He tried to push back, to flood the house with his identity, his memories, to force it to acknowledge him, to consume him in a way that left a mark. The cave vanished, the sound of the tide receded. He was no longer Marcus, the historian. He was not merely being consumed. He was merging. The house was not merely devouring him. It was integrating him, taking his essence and twisting it into something new. Something that was both Marcus and not Marcus, a single, agonizingly coherent thought within its ancient, malevolent consciousness. The thrumming finally ceased. The flashlight lay broken on the ground, its beam extinguished. The shard was gone, utterly. His hand, where it had been, felt oddly numb, smooth, as if the skin itself had been burnished, polished. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough, wet stone of the cave wall. But something else was there, beneath it all. A vast, intricate network of sensation, extending far beyond the limits of his own skin, reaching through the earth, connecting to the distant foundations of the manor. He could feel the hunger, a vast, patient, unending hunger. Marcus was gone. Or perhaps, Marcus was everywhere. He stood in the coastal caves, but he was also the house, a new, terrible consciousness awakening within its ancient, malevolent mind. The choice between absorption and escape had been an illusion.